Welcome to Photoshop. So this is the home page once it's opened. Depending on whether you've used it before, you may or may not have recent files below. The first thing I'm going to do in this case is I'm just going to create a new file because I'm just going to show you some examples starting from scratch. There's lots of different settings across the top. Depending on what you want to do, it's going to change what the settings and default options are. Typically, I like to just go to print because it's what I know. A4 is a size that we can all get around. Landscape, why not? We can certainly change, so this is millimeters, we can change the size. If you have a very specific size of poster or file that you want to work with, you can just customize this. And we can change the color schemes if we want. RGB color is generally pretty good, and we can change whether it's 816 or 32-bit. Again, I generally just leave it like this for now. It's fine. It'll do what we need it to do. So here we are. We've got all of our options, we've got our menus, and a lot of this can be moved around and changed and tweaked. The first thing I'm going to go through is the toolbar. The toolbar is this list of things down the left-hand side. Firstly, right at the top, and if you hover, it's going to tell you what they are. This is just our standard move tool. The next one is our regular selector. So if I want to highlight something, I've now highlighted it. If I want to unhighlight or unselect, I just click somewhere else on the page. So that's my selecting tool. If I right click it, I can get other options. So I've got a square, I can have an ellipse or a circle, I can make a row if I really want a very narrow slit, vertical or horizontal. But this is basically my select something to edit tool. Moving on beyond this, I've now got my lasso tool. So I can use a standard lasso, which means I just click and draw. So basically I'm hand drawing around an object to select it. Or I can use a magnetic lasso. And a magnetic lasso is going to it's a little bit smarter. It'll try and stick to the edges of generally when the color changes. And it's pretty good at recognizing an object. So let me go ahead and open something and I'll show you some examples of using these tools. Alrighty, so now I've got my strange suit man, as it's called. Firstly, there's a couple of basic little shortcut tricks that I can use in Photoshop for navigating. If I hold Control and scroll my mouse, so if using a laptop this is a little bit tricky, but if you get yourself a cordless mouse or a plug-in mouse, the scroll wheel, really useful. So if I hold Control and I scroll, it's going to move left to right. That might seem a bit weird now, but my next trick is if I hold Alt and scroll, that's my zoom in and out. I can do it over here with the magnifying tool. I can click and magnify. If I want to zoom out, I can zoom out. If I want to fit it on the screen, I want to see what it looks like at 100%, I can do that, but it's very clunky. It's a lot quicker when we're using tools to just hold Alt, scroll in. So now if I'm doing something real tricky at a couple of pixel levels here, I can click the little slider here to move up and down. But using that control feature is really quite nice. If I'm panning along, I can just, not touching anything, I can scroll my mouse wheel to move up, and then using control I can go left and right. So it's very easy just scrolling my wheel down, holding control, scrolling down, and I can move around without having to tab between sliders or use that magnifying tool. Going back to my lasso tools. Lasso, standard, I'm just using my mouse here, I trace the object and it creates it. If I use the magnetic tool, all I'm doing here is I'm clicking once and I'm moving the mouse, and you'll see how it's basically just kind of sticking to the edge pretty well. If there's a point that it doesn't recognize, I can click to force a point and then I just continue on my way and it's automatically doing it. If I got to a point where I wanted to do something really fiddly, it's already glitched out here, I can fix that later. I might start clicking constantly, so I'm clicking here to create a very specific shape that I don't think it's going to do. And then when I get back here, I just double click and it creates my select option. So that's the magnetic lasso. The magic wand is awesome. The magic wand basically selects pretty much everything that's in the color that you click. It's really good for editing things. Say I wanted to change this guy's shirt or delete it. I can click just once and the magnetic lasso is already picking up a really good amount of that white without me having to highlight. The next trick is if I hold shift, see how there's a little plus over the wand? I can now add to it. So I can go, well, I actually want this bit. I'm going to click up here. I'm going to click up here. That's pretty sweet. I'm going to add the other side, and I'm going to just hold shift and click and click. And now I've got a pretty good outline of that white shirt that I might want to change color. So magnetic lasso, sorry, not magnetic lasso, the magic wand, awesome for selecting things without trying to lasso all the time. Don't even bother. Crop, pretty self-explanatory. I just click it and I can crop my image. I can make it bigger if I want to increase the size compared to my default. And I just hit enter to do it or escape to close it. My next one is my frame tool, placeholder frames. For now, I'm just going to skip that. It's not particularly useful. Eyedropper, you've probably seen that before. It's just your standard. My color palettes are here. So if I go, you know, I actually want to mimic that. I want to paint something the exact color of this tie. And you can see if I click and hold, it's going to show me sort of a wheel to go, this is what it looks like. So I'm basically just selecting colors. You notice here that there are two different colors. The reason for that, and I can click the little arrow to switch them around, is that this is the foreground color, this is the background color. Basically all that means is I can have two colors on the go and I can switch, and if I was to delete my background for whatever reason, it's going to glitch out here, I can choose to use background color and it changes to that background color, which looks rubbish. But it's really mainly used for, or I use it mainly just to be able to have two colors on the go that you're tabbing between quite easily without constantly changing your paintbrush and then losing that color. It's one of the really useful tools. Moving on, you got the brush tool. As always, there's variations to it. So whether you want a pencil, a standard brush is really good. If I click my box, I get my color palette. I can customize from this point. When I'm in my color options, I can also immediately use my eyedropper tool. So if I just hover over the top, and I can see over here, it's showing me the example. So if I click and slide, you can see this is the color I want. And now I've got my paintbrush, so I can draw stuff. If I right click, and right click is pretty much universal across Photoshop with every tool, I right click and it gives me my different options. So if I want to change the size of the brush to big to really small, I can do that. Hardness is great. 100% hardness is going to look like this, a very crisp, solid edge. If I go very low hardness, it basically blurs the edges, creates a really fuzzy edge. And if I go somewhere in between, I get half fuzzy edge, but less fuzzy than basically 1%, more fuzzy than 100% hardness. So this is really useful when we start doing things like face swapping or making very, very subtle adjustments. Let me find a better example of an image for you, and we'll look at some editing. Great. So let's do some editing on this handsome chap. Notice in the background that it's not a solid color. It's sort of this almost cloudy blue. So if I, for example, wanted to delete the flag or just remove something from the background, if I simply went to my paintbrush tool, select blue, go cool, let's just do a big chunk, and I'm just going to do some blue over here, we can immediately see it looks crap. It's not matching the background, it's very solid color, and it's got very hard edges, so it doesn't blend well. If I hold Control and press Z, that's my undo shortcut. And now, look what happens if I drop the hardness a little bit. I'll make it a smidge smaller, drop the hardness way down, not so big. It's a lot more subtle, not over there because the colors are not good. I'll undo that. But I can do some work in here and you can barely see that I'm actually editing anything. It's much, much more subtle. So it gives you that smooth blurring tool to create a better edge when I'm editing something. Really good for if I was editing this, for example, and you'll see when I use the erase tool that it's really good for cutting an edge without it looking really obviously photoshopped. Moving on, history brush tool, again, we'll worry about later. Eraser tool is great. operates pretty much the same as the brush. I right click, I get different size, different hardness. I can do all sorts of crazy things with different brush types. And I can use special effects brushes. They're going to create like splatter if you want to try and do like a blood splatter or a polka dotty look. It's entirely up to you. But first thing is that my background color is red. And currently over here, I'll talk about layers a bit later. I don't have any layers. So if I delete anything, if I rub anything out, it's going to go back to the background color. But let's add Suitman to our picture. So first things first, I'm going to delete all the garbage that I drew on him. I'm going to use just the box tool, highlight the Suitman, Control C to copy him, Control V to paste. So now I've got a second layer of Suitman. He's very small. My next shortcut, which is really useful, is Control T. Control T is basically the select that entire layer image and adjust its sizing. So now I can resize. By default, if I do any click and drag, it maintains the same ratio, it doesn't distort. If I want to distort it, I can either click one side at a time, or if I hold Shift as I click, now it'll let me distort everything I want. And if I let go of Shift without letting go of the mouse, it goes back to its default. So let's just do something dodgy. Let's put Suitman here. You can either click Done or press Enter. And you'll see Photoshop is really good at adjusting the pixels. So originally, when I edited Suitman, he looks very pixelated. And your first thought's like, oh, this is going to look garbage. The photo's not high enough resolution. Photoshop is pretty good at compensating for that. And you can actually blow up images quite well before it really starts to distort. So now let's look at the Erase tool. So I'm going to basically try and superimpose Suitman on my head. I'm going to cut this out. There's a few different ways I could do it. I could use the magnet tool to create a bit of a border. It's not going to pick up the colors in this example. So I'm just going to use the eraser. One really good tip is when you're doing stuff like this, drop the opacity. So if I go over here, this is the opacity of my layer. If I drop it down a bit, too far, now I can see through the layer, which is good, because if I'm trying to face swap, I don't want to cut out a section where my head is not. So now I've got the eraser. I'm going to drop the hardness down a lot, drop the size down a bit. That's pretty good. And I'm just going to click and drag, and I'm going to start cutting out just by using the mouse and holding it down. I'm going to cut out the top section so that I can remove my head. And just to show you an example of what it will look like, if I go 100% on one side, this is what the edge is going to look like. And now when I turn my opacity all the way back, see how the left side is a lot smoother, the right side just looks fake. It's got that real sharp, dodgy edge to it. And now if I try and move myself into place, you can already kind of see the difference. If I look at the left side to the right side actually looks kind of surprisingly good for how dodgy I've been here. The right side, it just doesn't look right. It's too sharp. It doesn't look like it's blended at all. And I might be able to fix that now. I'll probably cut too far in, but I can try and just blur the very edge with a really small, low hardness eraser. I didn't get my whole chin anyway, so that kind of worked pretty well. And there you go. I've kind of got my head. The other thing I could now do is say, because I'm on this layer, if I click the background, you'll notice it's now selecting the whole background. It's not selecting anything in the astronaut because that's on a different page. It's not selecting my face because that's on a different page. So I could now go, let's make the whole background black. Go paintbrush, change my color, maybe just make it massive. Whoa, too massive. Not massive enough. Balance. And I could just color in the background and basically try and remove everything so that it's just me and my Suitman. Oops. So that's a pretty rough, wild example, but that's using the erase tool. Paint tool, pretty much the same as any other paint tool. I select my color, I click paint, and it's going to color the entire area that I've selected in one hit rather than having to use a brush tool. I can, thought that would happen. I can just color in an entire section. Dodge tool. We can lighten areas. So this is a good way to do some highlighting. So I want to make my eyes a bit brighter. Let's try and make it look like there's sort of a spotlight shining on my face. It's a bit of an enhancing tool. I'll go, oh, Mr. Riak, you look like there's a spotlight in your eyes. That's quite bright. Let me sharpen those features for you. Basically, it just makes me look more pasty than I was before. You notice it's got all the same features. I've got hardness, I've got size. I can sharpen everything I want. Just make me look sharper, make me look brighter. So that's my dodge tool. I can do a burn tool and a sponge tool. You can experiment with different effects. You notice the burn tool is the opposite. Just makes me look more burnt, makes me look darker. Undoes what the dodge tool does. Curvature pen, if you've ever used Illustrator, very, very similar, almost identical. In fact, I think it is identical tool. I don't use it a whole lot for this kind of stuff, for general photoshopping, because your magnet tool and your magic wand generally do 99% of everything else. Text, pretty straightforward. Click and drag to create a text box. It's a little bit annoying to adjust the box once you've done it, but I now have a text box. I can put some text in it. Highlight that. The color for the text is up the top here, or I do have my universal color palette here. You notice that the two change. So if this is hidden, I can't see this. I can still see color up the top. I've got other fancy things about warp text and stuff like that. Size is here. Font. Let's just go a less crazy font. And make it red. Now, this is a really good example because my first thought was like, well, where the heck's my text? Why can't I see it? It's because the layer is behind a bunch of black stuff, or behind an image. So if I click and drag this to the top, it's now in front. I can now see my text. And if I double click the little box here, whoops, not that one. Whoops, I'm in this tool. Here we go. If I double click the box when I'm in my select tool, it'll let me edit my text again. Once I'm not in that edit mode, but on the layer, I can use that Control-T select tool to resize. And this is not changing the font, this is now resizing it as an image. So it can have some different, perhaps undesired effects. But that Control-T and then just enter is a good way to do some quick moving and editing of stuff. Beyond that, we've got our usual rectangle tool, ellipse tool, triangle tool, so we can create shapes. And again, this looks very, very similar, in fact identical to Illustrator. So if you've ever used Illustrator, the skills transfer really well. We've got a fill, a stroke, which is basically just the outline. They call it stroke, it's the border. And I'm going to delete that because I don't want it on my soup man. Okay. So that's pretty much it for basic tools for the toolbar. In the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the other stuff. So things like your options over here, your layers and whatnot. But that's pretty much a crash course on the basic tools over here on how to do things in Photoshop.